Hi, I'm Kim Mooney. Welcome back to another episode of Life and Death, Living Fully and Dying Well. This is going to be an amazing show. I have three people here. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, but I have one gentleman who's coming in on Skype, just so you know. I would like to say before we start, we're going to be talking about near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and shared crossing experiences. And this is a range of experiences that I'd never even known existed until I started trying to put this show together. I'll tell you one small story, and that is that as I was researching this, I found out that there was a physician in the 1920s whose goal was to measure the weight of the soul.
I heard about that.
And to try to prove that when someone died, they actually were lighter. And of course, the evidence was not very strong, and they refuted it. And I would refute it personally because he decided that he couldn't weigh the difference in dogs, so dogs didn't have soul. And to me, that just kind of threw the whole thing out right there. So would you introduce yourselves, and we'll start from there.
All right. I'm Nancy Ryans. I'm an author and an artist. I'm also a former scientist, and I've been known as the atheist who went to heaven. About 2 years ago, I had a near-death experience as the result of a really traumatic accident, which completely changed my life forever. I'm no longer an atheist. Now I go around talking about what it's like to die and what heaven's all about.
So what is your title again, The Atheist?
The atheist who went to heaven.
That's great. And what about you, Thomas?
Yeah, so my name is Thomas Abraham, and I am a PhD student studying psychology. I study cognition and emotion in the brain. I'm also a volunteer with the International Academy of Consciousness, which is a global nonprofit organization, 100% volunteer-based organization. And what we do at the IAC is we try to study consciousness from a multidimensional perspective. That means really looking at all aspects of the consciousness and its attributes, such as our parapsychic abilities and our ability to leave the body through an out-of-body experience. So we've been offering classes for the past several years, teaching people to have their own experiences. Wow. We just started actually offering classes here in Denver last year and have classes going on this week.
Nice. I want to hear more about that in a minute.
Sure.
William in California. Hi, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the founder of the Shared Crossing Project, whose mission it is to raise awareness and educate people about the profound and healing experiences that are possible for the dying and their loved ones at the end of life. And we've been conducting a research project here in Santa Barbara, studying methods to facilitate the shared death experience. I should say I come from this work as a licensed marriage and family therapist, and with a good deal of experience as a hospice worker. And I've had 2 near-death experiences myself, as well as a variety of shared death experiences when I was working in hospice.
Great. You know, I think one of the things that's really important here is that it's very hard, as we had talked before, to get credibility. You know, the real world doesn't want to really know that this happens. They kind of think you're a little bit flaky. So to have research going on is really important.
It is.
It's a nice way to blend, as we were saying, the gap between what we used to call spirituality and science, because there's really no gap.
There isn't.
Yeah.
There isn't. And that's actually one of the things that after I had my near-death experience, I didn't want to tell anybody about it because I was terrified what everybody would think and how I would be condemned for inventing something so amazing and crazy at the same time. So I totally get it. But after a while, it became my reality. I realized that was more real than this, and that the two can live together side by side. There is no difference. We make one.
I want to hear about the bones of it. And we've talked before that we both think that the term near-death experience is a misnomer, that it actually is a death experience. But before that, would you just tell us a little bit about what happened with you? Because I think the personal experiences here really ground out why we're even talking about this.
Sure. So before my accident, I was actually an atheist. I was a scientist, a geologist, an archaeologist, did some science writing, and I was a staunch atheist. I didn't believe in any of this stuff. And I was out on a bike ride here in Colorado and got hit broadside by an SUV. And I had basically 2 near-death experiences during this whole time, one during the accident and one a couple of days later in surgery when I went in to have some repair work done on my spine. My spine was broken up in many, many different places. And it was that second NDE that really awakened something in me, or awoken me, whatever. It woke me up to the fact that there was something more than really just this, because this is all I really believed in, this physical reality. But after going to what I now call heaven, or you can use your own term for it, but going into that state of heaven really showed me that I was completely wrong, that there was much more to consciousness than just this physical plane. And it gave me a lot of hope and a lot of joy and a lot of happiness.
Yeah, a lot of people apparently come back feeling like their life has changed, the sense of meaning has changed, a greater understanding and a little more gusto.
Right, and that's how we know it's a true NDE, because the people that come back from a true NDE have amazing life shifts, and we can't deny what happened to us, and our entire view of life typically changes in a heartbeat. So we can't deny it at that point, and it can't not change us.
So I was surprised when she said, I know someone, Nancy introduced us, I know someone who talks about out-of-body experiences, because I had always thought that the near-death experience was the out-of-body experience.
Right, yeah, and these two terms are often kind of tough to disambiguate. The out-of-body experience is certainly a component of many near-death experiences, where someone has that perspective of maybe looking down on their body, or being kind of non-local to their physical body. But this is something that really the difference is maybe the mechanism of what's causing it, and the factors that kind of came around the instance itself. The out-of-body experience itself can be something that's very, very mundane, like maybe you take a quick nap on the couch and find yourself like looking down on your body. Or, it can certainly be provoked through trauma, and it can certainly be provoked through more of an intentional exercise, through meditation or concentration, and in order to really kind of reap the benefits of this experience.
Could you talk a little bit about the volitional, the intentional?
Sure. There's any number of methods to have an OBE, but generally it's going to revolve around some sort of progressive body relaxation, and essentially you're getting to the point where the body's asleep but the mind remains awake. And in many cultures, this is actually something that people kind of grow up with. For example, an Aboriginal culture, has this perspective that the dream state's not so, not like just this, how we see dreams as being something that's like less real than our physical reality, but that's something that's you want to be actively awake and present for. Versus kind of in our culture, oftentimes we want our head to hit the pillow, and we just want to be blackness until we wake up the next day, oftentimes, right? We kind of undervalue that aspect of our lives, right? So in trying to bring more lucidity in these states, we can actually maintain awareness while the body's sleeping. And it's interesting because sometimes you have this perspective. As a snorer myself, I've definitely had the experience where I can hear myself snoring, but I'm completely cognizant and aware of that. And that's a point where we can actually lift out and leave our physical body.
So in a way, what I hear you saying, and I love it that this is about consciousness, grounded consciousness, is that if you're living in a society or a culture where that's an accepted part of reality, it might be easier to do because you're in a larger consciousness around it.
Absolutely. I think, definitely being open and aware of these experiences makes us have a little bit more proclivity to have them, but also a way to contextualize them and put them in the framework of our day-to-day lives, right? So in Nancy's experience, for example, she's only 1 to 2 years out, and she's already has a huge network of like-minded people, other people that have had experiences and stuff. Whereas, in the 1970s, for example, people were having NDEs probably at the same rate of frequency, but they had nothing to couch that experience into, right? And so these little pockets of isolation of experiencers who are afraid to talk about it, or they don't even have the framework to process what happened to them, right? So I would venture a guess that the OBE is much more common than we actually think. It's that we're not A, having it with a high degree of lucidity, and B, when we come back from it, it's a lot easier to put it off as a dream or some other kind of fringe experience because we don't have the mental framework to even process it.
Makes sense. So William, I'm going to go to you because yours is the third kind of experience that I'd never heard until I talked to you before. And then I have a question for all of you.
All right.
Tell me,
So the shared death experience is really, if you look at it phenomenologically, it is identical to the near-death experience. And to be clear, each near-death experience and each shared death experience is completely unique, but the phenomena are very similar. And certainly, as Nancy was saying, the impact is one of the clearest ways to measure, because people come back from these experiences with a sense that they realize their true nature is eternal. If their loved ones are dying as they are in the shared death experience, then they realize they'll see their loved ones again. So let me say a little bit more about the shared death experience. This takes place between a caregiver and somebody, usually a loved one, who's dying. And in this experience, the shared death experiencer reports that he or she went into the initial stages of the afterlife with their now dead beloved. So what's so compelling about the SDE from a medical scientific standpoint is it's easy, or has been somewhat easy, for the medical establishment to discount the NDE because of biochemical reaction to fear and trauma in the brain. But the shared death experience is happening in a very healthy brain.
It is.
So, and like I said, there are the OBE is a central factor or component of the SDE, but there are a great deal of other phenomena as well that are, similar to the near-death experience.
So how do you know this is true?
Well, for me, I mean, I can tell you a story that really changed my life in this regard. I was working in hospice, Zen Hospice in San Francisco, around the 2000 or so. And there we're trained, and I was interested in hearing Thomas talk, because the training we get at Zen Hospice is very Buddhist. So we were very calm, very contemplative, clearing our minds regularly. And one afternoon I was sitting with a man who was very close to death, and I had been with him a number of previous days, and I was reading him a story. He happened to be a merchant marine, and I was reading him a Jack London story. And right in the midst of my reading, I found myself suspended above my body and his, and I looked over, and he was right with me. Like, we were both out of our bodies together. This is what we call a co-experienced OBE, and we acknowledged each other, and he looked at me with a great deal of assuredness and almost like confidence, as if to say, this is where I've been residing every now and then. I mean, wow. He was kind of telling me, hey, this is my reality. I was very much, I was kind of stunned, but not at all scared. It was like, oh my. And then sometime later, I went back into my physical body, and I don't even think I stopped reading, as best I can remember. I don't know how long I was there, but that experience, at that point in time, I knew nothing of the shared death experience. The research that really changed, or I should say brought this phenomena of the shared death experience. So Raymond Moody's book, Glimpses of Eternity, in 2011, that was the book that brought the shared death experience to the West, and certainly it really gave us some handles to understand it. And for me, as soon as I heard Raymond speak about it about the same time, and when I heard that, I realized that I had had a number of these experiences during my time as a hospice worker. So I know they're real.
So yeah, that's what I wanted. When you hear it out of somebody's mouth and you hear the story, it makes a lot more sense. But so the question that came up is, you had them and you hadn't defined them, you hadn't been willing to talk about them. When you say you'd had some before, context.
Yeah, once again, I really think Thomas's introduction was quite astute. I did not have a context to place this experience in. And to be honest about it, really honest, is I had two near-death experiences, one in 1979 and one in 1990. And I didn't talk about those either until the mid-90s. And it's because I was a mainstream guy, largely well-educated, and there was, if I shared this with my colleagues and friends, they would look at me askew. There was no upside for me in sharing this. So now that's why Raymond Moody's research is such a gift to us, because it gives us credibility, as you said. Kim, you brought that up as a challenge for these types of experiences. But now we know the research is there, and we know this happens often. I say often, I think it happens in my experience now. Our research is indicating that with the training we provide for our now over 100 participants in our training program, when someone dies, we're up around, I dare say, 60 to 75% of our participants are having some very significant shared death, shared crossing type phenomenon.
Wow,
that is life transforming.
Wonderful.
So in a way, the near-death experience is the only one that's not volitional, that you're not asking for it, just you get it.
That's right. I wasn't asking for it.
Yeah.
Although maybe I was asking for it at some level. No, it was, for me, it was completely involuntary. The accident itself was something I tried to avoid, but couldn't, and I didn't have any control over the death process. I started to die. I didn't actually fully die on the scene, but I didn't have any control over what was going on with how my consciousness separated out from my body at that point. And again, with the NDE that I had during surgery, completely out of my control. I mean, I was given the anesthesia, and at some point I had a reaction to that anesthesia, and poof, off I was, walking around in this beautiful place of hills and valleys and love and peace, and I was thinking, this is awesome. And I don't believe in it.
And that happens to me in real life a lot of times too. But this really brings up, we haven't really talked about the nuts and bolts. Now, one thing I'll just say it's really interesting is that yours experience is not volitional. It happens to you. You're talking about something that can or cannot.
Sure.
And William, you're talking about sitting down deliberately and asking for this and learning how to do it.
Well, we're the first organization I'm familiar with that's actually attempting, and now with some success, to facilitate or enable these experiences. But to be clear, prior to, like I say, prior to our mission, I don't know of any other organizations or people who have been trying to facilitate a shared death experience. In fact, Raymond Moody has said until recently that he thinks these are completely random and spontaneous.
Okay. So can we just go back, just like in the movies, and say, what are the components? Because I think people go, oh yeah, you die, you lift off, you go, you fly around, and then you hit the light and they tell you to come back. That's kind of what it is. So.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about the NDE, and like William mentioned, that each NDE really is different, but they all share some similar components, and the similar components are obviously the death part. We have to have the death part in order to have the NDE, and it can happen as a result of an accident. It can happen as a result of an illness, or in my case, like surgery. So it can happen in any one of a number of ways that our lives are threatened, and we flatline and begin the death process. Some people spend a little bit of time hovering around the room, so they might be in surgery and looking down on the doctors performing the operation, which can freak some people out.
But this is also where it does get credibility. When
Right.
people are sitting there describing the conversations and what was going on, that's a hard thing to refute.
Right. In fact, I have a longtime acquaintance of mine, a friend who's an engineer, and I won't say his name because he doesn't want anybody to
He's
know.
not out?
He's not out yet. But he had an NDE in surgery back in the late 70s, and this was a time when nobody really was talking about it. And he knew for him it was real because he separated from his body during surgery when he flatlined, and he was actually in surgery to remove some cancerous tumors. And he floated around the operating room watching them try to revive him. And then he went out of the OR and went to the nurses' station and listened to the conversation that one of the nurses was having with the doctor. So when they revived him, and a couple of days later, he talked about what the nurse was saying to the doctor, to the nurse, and it totally freaked her out because she knew at that point that he was telling the truth. And he knew at that point that what he experienced was real. So a lot of people actually do hover and float around and look at loved ones or listen to conversations. Many of us go through a tunnel or some kind of a tunnel-like structure, or we go directly to this big bright light. Some of us get directly transported to a place we might call heaven or the afterlife. And that's what happened to me. I didn't go through any of the floating around the room or going through a tunnel. I went directly there. I guess I needed a lot of time with God.
And you've been there twice, so apparently you weren't a good student.
I guess, yeah, I needed that second time. But a lot of us go right to heaven, and during that time, many of us are taught things that we haven't learned on earth. We might meet up with deceased loved ones. We might meet up with what we might call angels or spirit guides or even God. We learn things that are completely new to us or that we've forgotten. Sometimes
Are
we're...
they facts? Are they the nature of life? Or are they just
Usually-
awarenesses?
Yeah, usually the nature of life or what we need to change to make our lives better. Our guides are there to really help us live life better. That's what it's all about. That's what the NDE is really all about. It's really about bringing that vision of heaven back to earth so we can live a beautiful life here. And many of us are given that insight of what can we do here on earth? What can we take back from our experience to make our lives here much better and much more heaven-like? So a lot of us come back with this, we're fired up to change things. We're fired up to change our lives and to make things better and to have better connections with our loved ones, or maybe even change a career because something doesn't feel right anymore. Make a difference in the world in whatever way we can. So yeah, that's where we come back with this new insight into how we fit into the world, the way that we were meant to fit into the world when we were born, but we got kind of sidetracked along the way.
Hey, I want to ask William to add on to that, and I think, Thomas, that yours is a little different. I have a specific question around that.
Sure.
But William, can you add to what Nancy was talking about, or flesh it out in the experiences you've dealt with?
I sure can. I think Nancy did a great job of defining it as well as it can be. But I can add my two near-death experiences. My first one was when I was 17 years old. It was a high-speed skiing accident, and I was catapulted out of my body on contact. And next thing I remember, I was looking down at the ski area, and I could see myself far away. And I just went away from Earth very quickly, went through the rib tunnel, saw a very detailed review of my life that was very persuasive, and it was a teaching. It was a real teaching on karma for my life, and I realized that every interaction that I had with anybody or anything mattered. And that was very profound to me.
William, thank you. That is a perfect example of what we've heard from everybody here today, that the greatest gift that we come back with is compassion, self-compassion and compassion for others. And what a wonderful thing that is to bring into the world.
Absolutely.
So I hope that some of you out there have actually found a reason to believe in this a little bit more, this idea of living outside of our normal consciousness. And for all of those of you who have not been out before, this is a perfect time to come out and tell other people and just come out. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you
And
very much.
thank you for watching this episode of Life and Death, Living Fully, Dying Well, and we hope to see you again next week.
Today